Good day, and welcome to another episode of What's Happening Today, presented to you by Rapido News Network. In our first story, we will discuss China's economic growth, which is slowing sharply as COVID policy takes a toll. Next, we will talk about Senator Manchin pulling the plug on climate and tax talks, shrinking President Biden's domestic plans. Post that, we will discuss a story from Manhattan in which Ivana Trump, ex-wife of former President Donald Trump and a businesswoman, dies at 73. After that, we will talk about stubborn division in approach towards tackling Iran were on display during a news event where the leaders of both Israel and United States were present. Post that, we will discuss the House passing $840 billion military policy bill. And in our final story, we will talk about the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. So let's get started. In our first story, we will discuss the Chinese economy, which grew this spring at its slowest rate since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, a sharp slowdown from a COVID-19 policy that continues to prompt widespread lockdowns and mass quarantines, bringing some business activities to a complete halt. The National Bureau of Statistics said on Friday that the economy expanded 0.4% from year earlier in the second quarter, the lowest rate of growth since the first 3 months of 2020. That was when the country effectively shut down to fight the early stages of the pandemic. The 2020 downturn was short-lived, with the Chinese economy recovering almost immediately, but the current outlook is not so promising. Unemployment is close to the highest level on record. The housing market is still a mess, and small businesses are bearing the brunt of weakness in consumer spending. The slowing economy poses a political problem for China, which is trying to project unwavering strength and stability in a year when it is scheduled to hold its Communist Party Congress. Xi Jinping, the country's leader, is expected to coast for another 5-year terms. Now, in our next story, on Senator Joe Manchin, Democrat of West Virginia, pulled the plug on Thursday on negotiations to salvage key piece of President Biden's agenda, informing his party's leader that he would not support funding for climate or energy programs or raising tax on wealthy Americans and corporations. The decision by Mr. Manchin, a conservative leading Democrat whose opposition has effectively stalled Mr. Biden's economic package in the evenly divided Senate, dealt a devastating blow to his party's effort to enact a broad social safety net, climate and tax package. In recent months, Democrats had slashed their ambitions for such a plan to win over Mr. Manchin, hoping that he would agree to support even a fraction of the sweeping initiative they once envisioned. His abrupt shift appeared to dash those aspirations. In a meeting on Thursday with Senator Chuck Schumer of New York, who is also the majority leader, Mr. Manchin said he would support a package that would include a negotiated plan aimed at lowering the cost of prescription drugs and an extension of expanded Affordable Care Act subsidies, which are set to lapse at the end of this year. The shift capped off weeks of painstaking negotiations to cobble together a package that could win Mr. Manchin's support. It came 7 months after West Virginia's senator abruptly walked from talks and rejected a far larger plan. Political headlines are of no value to the millions of Americans struggling to afford grocery and gas as inflation soars to 9.1%, said Sam Runyon, a spokeswoman for Mr. Manchin. Senator Manchin believes it's time for leaders to put political agendas aside, reevaluate and adjust to the economic realities the country faces to avoid taking steps that add fuel to the inflation fire. Senator Manchin has not walked away from the table, she further added. Now, in our next story, Ivana Trump, the glamorous Czech American businesswoman whose high-profile marriage to the former President Donald Trump in the 1980s established them as one of the era's quintessential New York power couples, died on Thursday at her home in Manhattan. She was 73 at the time of her death. Mr. Trump announced her death in a statement on Truth Social, the conservative social media platform he founded. The New York City police were investigating whether Ms. Trump fell down the stairs at her townhouse on the Upper East Side in Manhattan, according to the two law enforcement officials with the knowledge of the matter. One of the officials said that there was no sign of forced entry at the home and that the death appeared to be accidental. A spokeswoman for the city's chief medical examiner's office said it would investigate the death even further. Now, in our next story, President Joe Biden on Thursday issued one of the bluntest warning to Tehran of his presidency, committing to Israel's leader that we will not allow Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon. But Israel's caretaker Prime Minister Yair Lapid pushed even further, asking all democratic nations to vow to act if the Iranians continue to develop their nuclear program. The distinction between Mr. Biden's vow to stop a weapon and Mr. Lapid's insistence on destroying Iran's entire program was more than Semitic. It goes to the heart of their countries' differing approaches in dealing with Iran's nuclear ambitions. Even amid frequent and public affirmations of the close relationship between Israel and the United States, the differences over how to handle Iran remain stubborn. Several times on Thursday, members of Israel's leadership publicly and privately urged that the United States develop a more credible military option to take out Iran's nuclear facility. As a way of convincing Tehran it must halt a rapidly accelerating program, Israel has conducted a series of covert sabotage and assassination operations to slow Iran's ability to enrich nuclear fuel, while Mr. Biden has insisted that diplomacy and the restoration of the 2015 Iran nuclear agreement are the best ways to find a permanent solution. If they continue to develop their nuclear program, the free world will use force, Mr. Lapid said at the opening of a news conference in Jerusalem after the two leaders met as part of Mr. Biden's 4-day visit to the Middle East. During those remarks, Mr. Biden listened attentively but never repeated that commitment. Instead, he stuck to talking about blocking Iran from obtaining a weapon, not a program that might be intended to develop one. Now, in our next story, the House on Thursday passed an $840 billion policy bill that would increase President Biden's requested Pentagon budget by $37 billion, reflecting a growing bipartisan appetite in Congress to raise military spendings amid new threats from Russia and China. The legislation would grant a 4.6% pay raise to military personnel, limit the Biden's administration ability to sell F-16 fighter jets to Turkey, and require top national security agencies to report on and combat white supremacists and neo-Nazi activity in federal law enforcement and the armed forces. While the measure drew wide bipartisan support, passing 329 to 101, Republicans had unanimously opposed the mandate to root out white supremacy, arguing that no such effort was needed. The bill also contains provisions aimed at mitigating civilian deaths and injuries caused by U.S. military operations and authorizing $100 million for assistance to Ukrainian military pilots. And it would also repeal 2002 law authorizing the invasion of Iraq, which has been stretched by multiple administrations to justify military actions around the world. We have a complex threat environment when you look at Russia, China, and Iran, said Representative Adam Smith, Democrat of Washington and the chairman of the Armed Service Committee. Now, in our final story on the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, a volley of Russian cruise missiles hit a shopping center, a dance studio, and a wedding hall in central Ukraine on Thursday, killing at least 23 people and setting off a frantic search for dozens more lost in the rubble. In a latest strike to hit the civilian area far from the front lines, 3 children were among dead. President Volodymyr Zelensky's office said the attack involved 3-caliber cruise missiles that struck the city at about 10:30 a.m. and were launched from a submarine in a Black Sea. His office said more than 70 people, including 3 children, were hospitalized after the missile hit the center of Vinnytsia, a typically sleepy provincial capital some 200 miles from the coast, and left behind a harrowing scene of smoking ruins. Grooms once carried their bride from the wedding hall, a well-known local landmark, and a building next door was the site of a photography studio where a continuous stream of children had gathered to take pictures for their school album. Even hours after the strike, as firefighters doused water on the smoldering husks of overturned cars, bystanders stood in shock. The Ukrainian State Emergency Service said that more than 24 people remained unaccounted for as of late Thursday. It said a search effort was underway in rubble in part of a town where people typically ran errands at the shopping center to buy household goods or attend celebration at the wedding hall. In his nightly address, Mr. Zelensky called on Ukraine's allies to punish Russia for this attack. This day once again proved that Russia must be officially recognized as a terrorist state. He said, if there had been a missile attack in Dallas or Dresden, God forbid, Mr. Zelensky said, what would it be called? Wouldn't it be called terrorism? More than 50 buildings were damaged in the attack. Viktor Vitovetsky, an emergency service official, said at a news conference on Thursday. Dozens of emergency crew workers were helping to clear the rubble and search for survivors, he further added. Now that was all for the major news update for July 15th. Stay tuned for our next update on the ongoing world affairs. We hope that you find this video useful. If you like this video, hit like. And for a continued update on what's happening around the world, consider subscribing. To get notified whenever we post something new, hit that bell icon. If you have any comments or any suggestions for us, please let us know in the comment sections below. Thank you.